It's a really nice place, Mom. Like a resort. My son, Mark, smiled a practiced, reassuring smile as the automatic doors of Golden Years Villa hissed shut behind me. He and his wife promised they were just giving me a little vacation while they tidied up my house. The next day, I saw the for sale sign go up on my neighbor's TV news report about the hot SoCal real estate market. They thought they were being clever, parking me in a gilded cage while they cashed in my life's work. They thought they knew everything about that house. They were wrong. They had forgotten about my husband's last secret, buried in the foundation, a hidden safe they could never find. This is the story of a son who tried to sell his mother's past and a secret that completely destroyed his future. If you believe that a family's foundation is more than just concrete, subscribe now and hit the notification bell, because you are about to witness the ultimate house clearing. The air at Golden Years Villa smelled of lavender-scented disinfectant and quiet desperation. It was, as my son Mark had promised, a nice place, if your definition of nice was beige walls, bland, artfully arranged food, and an activities calendar that featured sit and stretch as a highlight. It was a high-end holding pen, a place where the wealthy children of Los Angeles could store their inconvenient parents without feeling too guilty. My room overlooked a perfectly manicured courtyard where a few other residents sat staring into the middle distance, lost in memories of homes they would never see again. I refused to become one of them. Mark and his wife Tiffany had orchestrated the whole thing with the chilling efficiency of a corporate takeover. They had called it an intervention. I had been feeling a bit unsteady on my feet after a bout of flu, and they had seized on it, their faces masks of performative concern. "You're not safe alone in that big house, Mom," Tiffany had said, her voice dripping with a sympathy so fake it was practically viscous. "We found this amazing place in the valley, just for a few weeks, while we get some safety rails installed and declutter a bit for you." I was tired. I was grieving my husband Frank, who had passed a year earlier, and in a moment of weakness, I had agreed to just try it for a weekend. The weekend turned into a permanent stay with the swift, silent click of a closing door. The house they were decluttering was my soul. It was a classic 1960s ranch-style home in Pasadena, nestled against the foothills. Frank, a brilliant and meticulous civil engineer, had bought the lot for a song and built the house with his own two hands. He knew every stud in the walls, every pipe under the floorboards. It was the house where we had raised Mark, the house where I had planted a garden of roses that were the envy of the neighborhood, the house where I had held Frank's hand as he took his last breath. To my son and his wife, it was no longer a home. It was an asset. A multi-million-dollar asset in a ridiculously overinflated real estate market, the key to the lavish, debt-fueled lifestyle they flaunted on Instagram. The final betrayal came on my third day at Golden Years. I was watching the local news when a perky reporter began a segment on the feeding frenzy in the LA housing market. And then I saw it. My house. My rose garden. And a bright red for sale sign hammered into my lawn. The reporter mentioned it had been listed that morning and was already expected to start a bidding war. The breath left my body in a ragged gasp. They hadn't even waited a week. My grief, which had been a soft, heavy blanket, instantly crystallized into something sharp, cold, and hard as a diamond. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought I was a frail, confused old woman. They had forgotten who I was, and more importantly, they had forgotten who my husband was. Frank was a man of secrets, a man who believed in contingency plans. And his greatest contingency plan was waiting for them, silent and invisible, in the cool, dark earth beneath the basement floor. Will this heartless betrayal lead to a shocking karmic reckoning? This story of a hidden legacy is just getting started. If you're hooked by this story of karma, subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapter. Frank was the most honest man I ever knew, but he loved a good secret. He was a child of the Depression, and he had a deep, almost primal distrust of banks and institutions. He believed a man's real wealth should be kept where he could touch it. He was also a brilliant engineer with a love for puzzles and hidden mechanisms. Our house was his masterpiece, filled with clever practical features he had designed himself. The secret safe was his magnum opus. It wasn't a clunky metal box bolted to a wall. It was a custom-built, fireproof and waterproof cylinder, sunk into the concrete foundation of the basement, completely invisible and accessible only through a series of ingenious, non-obvious steps that only he and I knew. It was our secret, a game we played. For a rainy day, he would say with a wink. Our son Mark grew up in this house of love and practicality, but he had absorbed none of its lessons. He was a product of the modern California dream, which had less to do with hard work and more to do with disruption and image. He worked in tech marketing, a world of buzzwords and venture capital, and measured his success by his job title and the car he drove. He wasn't a bad person at his core, he was just weak, entitled, and utterly terrified of not living up to the lifestyle his peers projected online. The real engine behind this betrayal was his wife, Tiffany. She was a lifestyle blogger whose brand was a curated fantasy of effortless Orange County luxury. To her, my classic beloved Pasadena home was a teardown, a dated relic whose only value was the land it sat on. She saw the house not as a home, but as the down payment on a glass and steel monstrosity in Newport Beach. She was the one who filled Mark's head with ideas of unlocking the equity and maximizing their potential. She treated me with a cloying sweetness that was more insulting than open hostility. She saw me as a temporary obstacle, a sentimental old woman clinging to a past that was interfering with her perfectly filtered future. They were a terrifyingly effective team, his weakness and her greed, wrapped in a blanket of Californian self-help jargon about living their best life. What is this hidden safe hiding that could change everything? My first reaction, after the initial shock, was a surge of white-hot fury. My second was a chilling realization of my own helplessness. I was a prisoner. I had my phone, but my calls were monitored by a helpful staff who would report any agitated behavior to my son, who held my power of attorney for medical decisions. He had cleverly and cruelly trapped me in a system designed for my own protection. Any attempt to rage or protest would only be used as evidence of my cognitive decline, proof that he had done the right thing. The conflict, therefore, had to be fought silently, strategically. My first obstacle was information. I needed to know what was happening with the sale. I feigned a newfound interest in the nursing home's community spirit. I started joining the other residents in the common room, a place I had previously avoided. There I found my first ally, a retired accountant named Arthur, a sharp old man who was as bored as I was furious. He had a contraband laptop and a mastery of the internet. "They think we're just waiting to die," he grumbled. "They forget our minds still work." I told him my story. He was not surprised. He had seen it before. He became my intelligence officer. He looked up the listing for my house, found the realtor's name, and tracked the status of the sale. The news was worse than I imagined. Mark and Tiffany weren't just selling it, they were giving it away for a quick, all-cash offer. "It's an investment group," Arthur reported, squinting at his screen. "They're buying it as is. They want to close in 15 days. Your son is leaving at least $500,000 on the table for a fast payout." The speed was the new obstacle. I didn't have months, I had days. I had to get a message to the outside world, to the one person who could help me, but my every move was watched. The battle for my home, for my legacy, would have to be fought from inside the beige walls of Golden Years Villa. Will a secret from the past turn the tables? The ticking clock of the 15-day escrow was deafening. Every day that passed was another day closer to my home being gone forever. Mark and Tiffany, in their greed, had created the perfect storm of pressure. They visited me once during this time, their faces glowing with a false solicitousness. "The house is getting so much interest, Mom. You're going to be so proud of the value we're creating for the family," Mark had said, as if he were a triumphant CEO reporting to a shareholder. I played my part, the slightly confused but grateful mother. "That's wonderful, dear," I said, my voice meek. "Whatever you think is best." My only hope was a subplot of quiet rebellion I began to orchestrate. I needed a messenger, someone who could get a physical object out of the facility and past the watchful eyes of the staff. I found her in a young, overworked nursing aide named Sophia. She was a single mother, putting herself through night school, and she treated the residents with a genuine kindness that stood in stark contrast to the facility's corporate atmosphere. I saw in her a decency that my own son lacked. I began to build a relationship with her, telling her stories of my life, of Frank, of our house. One evening, when she was helping me with my medication, I told her the truth. I saw the flash of anger in her eyes on my behalf. "That's not right," she whispered. "What they're doing to you." The complexity was the immense risk to her. If she was caught, she would be fired instantly. I offered her money, but she refused. "My grandmother was treated like this," she said, her voice fierce. "I'll help you." The plan was set. Sophia would be my agent on the outside. But I couldn't send her to the house. It was too risky, with realtors and potential buyers constantly coming and going. I had to rely on the one thing I had here with me, the key to everything. But will the next event shock everyone? The object was a small, ornate silver locket. It was the first gift Frank had ever given me, and I never took it off. Mark and Tiffany saw it as just another piece of old jewelry. They had no idea of its true function. Frank, in his love for puzzles, had designed it himself. It wasn't just a locket, it was a key. Not a physical key, but a cipher. Inside, behind the tiny photos of a young me and a young Frank, were two minuscule, almost invisible engravings, a series of numbers, and a single cryptic word. This was the turning point, the desperate, long-shot gamble. I wrote a short, simple note. It read, "To Mr. David Chen at Chen & Associates Law. Frank's final contingency. He told me you'd know what this means." David Chen was our estate lawyer, a man as old and sharp as Arthur, and a keeper of all of Frank's secrets. I sealed the note in an envelope, along with the locket. The next morning, during her shift, I slipped the envelope to Sophia. "Please," I whispered, pressing her hand. "Just put it in the mail. It has to be sent today." She nodded, hiding it in the pocket of her scrubs, and walked out of the room. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. I had no idea if the letter would make it, or if Chen would understand the cryptic message. I was placing the entire fate of my vengeance, of my life, in the hands of a near stranger and a 50-year-old puzzle. The following afternoon, I was in the Serenity Garden when the head administrator of the facility approached me, a look of utter confusion on her face. "Mrs. Miller," she said, her voice flustered. "You have a visitor. A lawyer. He's very insistent." I turned, and walking across the perfect soulless lawn towards me was David Chen. He was holding the locket in the palm of his hand. He had understood. The power dynamic of my world had just been fundamentally and irrevocably altered. How will this shocking secret change their lives forever? This incredible twist has you hooked? Subscribe now for more stories of delicious karma. David Chen was a force of nature. He was a small, quiet man, but he radiated an aura of unshakable legal authority. He summarily dismissed the facility administrator's attempts to sit in on our private consultation. In the sterile, sun-bleached privacy of the gazebo, he got straight to the point. "Frank always said your son was a fool, Margaret." "I see he was right," he said, his voice grim. "The locket's numbers are a bank account Frank set up for you offshore, an account your son knows nothing about. The word is the final password. And the phrase 'final contingency' refers to the contents of the safe. He gave me a sealed letter with instructions on what to do if you ever sent that message. I was instructed to act on your behalf with extreme prejudice. The immediate consequence was that I was no longer a prisoner. I was a client. I had resources, I had power, and I had one of the sharpest legal minds in Los Angeles on my side. Chen immediately began the process of revoking Mark's power of attorney, citing elder abuse and financial exploitation. He informed the nursing home that from that moment on, all communication regarding my care would go through his office. The staff, who had treated me with condescending pity, now looked at me with a mixture of fear and awe. Meanwhile, Mark and Tiffany were in a state of blissful ignorance. They accepted the all-cash offer from the investment group. They signed the initial escrow papers, their minds already in the Newport Beach house, spending money they didn't have. They had no idea that a legal storm was gathering, that their mother, whom they had so neatly packaged and stored away, was now the one pulling the strings. The repercussions of their greed were about to crash down on them, and they were smiling and sipping lattes, completely unaware. Will they overcome this new challenge? My growth in this chapter was about rediscovering the woman I was before I became mom. For too long, my identity had been wrapped up in my son's happiness. I had enabled his weakness, mistaking it for love. Now, under Chen's guidance, I was overcoming decades of maternal instinct. The challenge was not to stop the sale of the house immediately. That would be too simple, too merciful. The challenge, as Chen explained, was to let them proceed, to let them get to the very brink of their victory, before showing them that the prize was an illusion. It was a cruel strategy, but it was a necessary one. This wasn't just about getting my house back, it was about delivering a lesson in consequences so profound that it would alter the very foundation of their lives. My transformation was from a passive victim to a strategic commander. I was no longer just reacting, I was planning, counterattacking. I gave Chen the detailed step-by-step instructions on how to open the safe. He hired a discreet, bonded security team. They would enter the house a few hours before the final closing, using a key I had hidden years ago, a key I had told Sophia about in my letters to Chen. They had one mission: to open the safe and retrieve its contents. I had to overcome the flicker of guilt that still remained. This was my son, after all. But then I would think of him leaving me in this beige room, of the for sale sign on my lawn, and the guilt would vanish, replaced by the cold, hard steel of resolve. Frank had built that house to be a fortress for our family. Mark had tried to sell it to fund a fantasy. I was not destroying my son's life, I was forcing him to finally live in a real one, free from the unearned shelter of his father's legacy. I was, in the end, doing what Frank had instructed in his letter. I was teaching our son the lesson he was no longer there to teach. But what awaits them in the next confrontation? The final days before the closing were a masterclass in legal maneuvering. Mr. Chen worked with silent, deadly precision. The day before the closing, Chen's security team executed their mission flawlessly. They entered the house in the dead of night, opened the safe, and removed its contents. They were in and out in less than an hour, leaving no trace. The climax was set for the title company's office in Century City. Mark and Tiffany were on their way, dreaming of the multi-million-dollar wire transfer that was moments away. They believed they were about to be crowned king and queen of their new perfect life. My preparation was simple. I got dressed. Not in the comfortable knits of a nursing home resident, but in the crisp, elegant power suit I used to wear to board meetings when I helped manage Frank's business affairs. Sophia did my hair and makeup. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a frail old woman. I saw Margaret Miller, the matriarch, the owner, the one in charge. Chen arrived to pick me up, his face grim and determined. He carried a heavy, old-fashioned leather briefcase. The tension was not in a fight, but in the impending surgical execution of a perfectly laid plan. They thought the story was over. They had no idea the final chapter was about to be read aloud, and they were the villains. The final confrontation will reveal everything, won't it? The conference room was all glass and chrome, a monument to the California dream Mark and Tiffany were so desperate to buy. They were already there, sitting with their realtor, their faces glowing with a greedy, triumphant light. They were laughing, probably about the first ridiculously expensive thing they were going to buy. When I walked in, followed by Mr. Chen, the laughter died in Mark's throat. His face went slack with shock. Tiffany's perfectly applied smile froze and then curdled into a sneer. "Mom? What are you doing here?" Mark stammered. "This is a private meeting." "I am aware," I said, my voice steady as I took a seat at the head of the table. "I'm here to protect my interests. And my property." The escrow officer, a flustered-looking woman, cleared her throat. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. The property is being sold by your son, Mark Miller, as the trustee of the Miller Family Trust." "That's where you are mistaken," Mr. Chen said, snapping open his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick, aged document, its paper yellowed with time, and slid it across the table. "This is the original hand-filed deed for the property at 450 Rosewood Lane, Pasadena. As you can see, it was filed in 1968. The climax was not a shout, it was the quiet rustling sound of old paper. Mark and Tiffany stared at the document. "So what?" Tiffany said, her voice sharp. "We have the deed." "You have a modern, digitized copy," Chen corrected. "This is the original. And I direct your attention to this clause here, handwritten and notarized by my father, I might add." He pointed to a line of elegant, faded ink. Frank was a brilliant engineer, but he was also a very careful man. "This clause states that the property was purchased and the house was constructed solely with funds from a premarital inheritance belonging to Frank Miller, and as such, the property is designated as his sole and separate property, to be passed in its entirety to his wife, Margaret Miller, upon his death, outside of any community trust." He let the legal jargon sink in. "The family trust your son is the trustee of? It contains Frank's stock portfolio and his liquid assets. It does not, and has never legally contained the house. Your son does not have the authority to sell this property, because he does not own it. His mother does." The vengeance was absolute. They hadn't just been caught, their entire premise was a legal fiction. They were trying to sell a house that had never, not for a single second, been theirs to sell. But how will this change their future? The room was silent, save for the sound of Tiffany's sharp, ragged breathing. Mark just stared at the old deed, his face the color of ash. He wasn't just losing the money, he was being confronted with the undeniable proof of his father's foresight, his father's complete lack of faith in his character. The sale, of course, was dead. The escrow officer, horrified at the legal implications, voided the entire transaction. The investment group's lawyers would be in touch. Mark and Tiffany walked out of that office not as triumphant millionaires, but as disgraced, humiliated frauds who were likely about to be sued. Their marriage, built on a foundation of shared greed, did not survive the loss of its primary objective. The blame and recriminations were immediate and brutal. Tiffany left within a month. Mark, now broke, alone, and facing legal bills, was forced to sell his luxury car and move into a small, bleak apartment in a less desirable part of the valley. He did not move back into the house. The memories were too painful. He had changed it, legally distinct, for its full market value. With the proceeds, he bought a beautiful little house in a quiet community in Santa Barbara. He donated a significant sum to a charity for the elderly that investigated and prosecuted cases of elder abuse. My vengeance had not just restored my freedom, it had created a shield for others. The emotional resolution was in the quiet peace of my new life, a life built not on what my husband had left me, but on the strengths he had rediscovered within myself. 6 months later, a letter arrived from Mark. It wasn't a demand or a threat. It was a single page, written by hand. He was working a regular 9 to 5 job for the first time in his life. He was in therapy. I am so sorry, Mommy read. That was right about me. I hope that one day, I can be a man I would have been proud of. I folded the letter, a single, cleansing tear rolling down my cheek. The house was gone. But I had finally gotten my son back. The mistreatment of the elderly is a silent epidemic, often perpetrated by those who are meant to be their protectors. This story is a powerful reminder that our elders are not disposable. They are living stories, with a strength and wisdom we should never underestimate. Have you ever witnessed a situation where an older person was disrespected or underestimated? Share your story in the comments below and let's stand together for the dignity of our seniors. If this story of a mother's strength moved you, please like and subscribe for more emotional tales of justice.